Hello and welcome to a very special edition of not the week in 60 minutes but the year in 60 minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday the 15th of December. It's been quite a year and there's a lot to talk about, so we are going to go through the key events of the last 12 months with our chairman, the great Andrew Neil, and the novelist and great Spectator columnist Lionel Shriver. We will then go to Ukraine, where we will talk to the novelist Andrey Kurkov about what has been going on there in the last 12 months. After that, we will be coming back to England to talk to our columnist Rod Liddle about wokery, what exactly it is, and whether it really exists at all. From Rod the Bogeyman, we will move to Fungus the Bogeyman. I will be talking about the late great illustrator Raymond Briggs, who died in August. Raymond Briggs was most famously the creator of The Snowman, which a lot of people watch at Christmas. I will be talking to Juliet Nicolson, the author, about her late friend. And finally, I will be resisting the urge to snog the Spectator contributor and comedian Andrew Watts as we talk about mistletoe. Before we get going, I would like to urge you all to subscribe to Spectator TV, which I'm sure you'd like to do. You can do that by hitting the subscribe button at the bottom of the screen and then clicking the bell icon at the top of the screen to make sure you never, ever miss an episode. I should also alert you to our Spectator Christmas offer, which is that for £12, just £12, you will get 12 weeks of The Spectator in print and online, and we will throw in, with extraordinary generosity, a bottle of Pol Roger champagne. Just go to spectator.co.uk/Santa to take advantage of that offer. Well, we are now approaching the end of 2022, and what a year it's been. I don't think I'm being excessively gloomy in saying that a lot of very bad things have happened. We've had the war in Ukraine, we've had an inflation crisis and an energy crisis, we've had the death of the Queen and chaos in Westminster. We've also had the threat, the looming threat, and indeed the reality now of strikes. I'm joined now by Andrew Neil, our chairman, and our columnist, Lionel Shriver, to look back at an extraordinary 2022. Andrew, I'll start with you. A lot of people talking about strikes at the moment, and there's often this phrase, the winter of discontent, and the newspapers often suggest that we are going through the 1970s again. Do you think such talk is exaggerated?
Yes, the only people who are comparing it to the 1970s never lived through the 1970s. And you just have to look at a chart of strikes just to take one metric. And strikes in the 70s, they're massive compared to now. I mean, it is true that we're in probably the most strikes in 10 years, though we've yet to reach a stage where any of these strikers really win. And I noticed that even Mr. Lynch of the RMT is getting increasingly irascible in broadcast interviews, which suggests to me that he thinks he's going to lose now. I did warn him in July of this year that he didn't have the power he thought he had, that working from home had changed all that, and that the railways were not as essential as before. So yeah, it's been a pretty grim year, I agree with that, but it's nothing like the 70s. In Britain, we've not had to call in the IMF, whereas we did in the 70s. There aren't strikes every day and the unions win every strike, which happened in the 70s. That's not happening. Inflation has not reached 25%, which it did in the 1970s, even though it's high. And interest rates, last time I looked, are still, around 2%, 2.5%, whereas then, in these days, they were over 20%. So, and Jimmy Carter had just come down from the mountain known as Camp David to say that America was gripped in a malaise. America has a lot of problems, but it's not quite a malaise at the moment. So it's difficult, it's tough for people having to live through these times. It's difficult compared to years gone by. And I think I would also say, I think the reason why it seems so grim is that this was really meant to be the year where we on both sides of the Atlantic, we boomed back from the pandemic. It was to be back to normality, growth would return, prosperity would return, and the combination of the war in Ukraine and inflation, which are linked, has meant that we've not boomed back at all. In fact, we're kind of treading water.
Lionel, do you think our industry, the media, I know you're a novelist, but you also do a bit of media, do you think we're to blame slightly for creating this climate of gloom? I mean, I keep reading about general strikes, and hasn't been a general strike since 1926, I think. And there's this sort of sense that actually, is it really a general strike? Because actually, as Andrew says, it's not really in the same sense. Are we journalists to blame for creating this climate of despair?
I think that might be giving journalists a little too much credit. I mean, everything that we're talking about is real and not the invention of the media. And there, even if the strikes are not as terrible as they were in the 1970s, what is driving the strikes is substantial. I mean, it's for one thing, it's the consequence of the lockdown policies and the extravagant amounts of money we spent on absolutely nothing during that period. And it seemed at first as if we were going to get away with it, and that it was like, oh, that's fine. The economy's bounced right back, and there was nothing wrong with having that response to COVID because we haven't suffered any consequences. And then because economics is a slow lumbering beast, and the results take a while to show up, and they're showing up. There's a way in which the war in Ukraine is doing politicians a favor, because it helps disguise the fact that a lot of this inflation is not due to Russia's invasion, but it is due to the excesses of pandemic response. And you can see that in the creeping up of inflation well before February 24th.
Andrew, I take Lionel's point that journalists probably shouldn't exaggerate how important we are in the world, but perhaps what I was getting at is maybe social media, since everyone is a journalist in a way on social media, and that contributes, Twitter in particular, to a kind of hysteria about things and a lack of a sense of perspective.
Yes, I mean, I think, we journalists, we do like bad news. Because for some reason we think it sells. Or maybe it's just more dramatic than good news. And social media has that in spades. I mean, it amplifies bad news. No one on social media, or very few people, actually tweet good news. There is one Twitter feed in Britain which does announce, Jefferson I think is called, it announces new investments in British industry and new infrastructure and so on. It's like a lone voice. It's one little ray of sunshine in a whole Twitter feed of misery there. And I think that has helped to amplify. There is also a particularly British characteristic at work here. It's not true where I am at the moment on the American side of the Atlantic, which is that there's a whole industry in Britain doing ourselves down. Indeed, there are some people are never happy unless they're doing ourselves down, unless they're doing the country down. And I think the whole Brexit debate made that worse, because the Remainers, they want to be vindicated in the stance they took, and they want the Brexiteers to be proved wrong. And so much is still seen through this prism of remain or leave. And they want Britain to fail because that will vindicate the decision they took to vote not to leave and show that all these Brexiteers were wrong in what they did. So that's added to the general predisposition of the British chattering classes to do the country down.
Well, Andrew, I'll stay with you. You are in New York at the moment. The latest economic news from America seems to be a little bit more cheerful. Inflation seems to be coming down. Do you get a sense that that can-do American spirit is still there, and they feel that next year is going to be a year in which America bounces back?
Yeah, I mean, the can-do spirit is still here, but it's not where I am. It's not in New York. I mean, New York is a shadow of its former self at the moment. Parts of it look like a shanty town. It's quite, it's a city I love, and I've been coming here and living here off and on since 1976. And it's back to the 70s. We talked about the 70s. New York, in many ways, is back to the 70s. It's dilapidated, it's shabby, it's got people shouting at you in the street, it's got a threatening sense to it again. Crime is rising, the place is filthy, retail stores are closed. I mean, I'm not in exactly the poorest part of New York. I'm in Midtown, and I just need to go up to 2nd Avenue, and every second retail unit is closed. I mean, the contrast with London is quite dramatic. I mean, in London now, you almost really wouldn't know there had been a pandemic. London is just kind of back to normal now. New York is not back to normal at all. And it looks to me it's actually got more decline in it before it gets back to that. But as we all know, New York is not America. And other parts of America are doing well. Outside the big cities, the country is coming back. And I think, as always, America was kind of first into this recession. I don't think the recession will be very deep, and it will be first out. Inflation is beginning to come down. There's been you add Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden together, there's been an incredible amount of Keynesian pump priming, which contributed, as Lionel was saying, to inflation. You can't blame it all on the war, that's for sure, in Ukraine. But I do think America will come out of it more quickly and help to drag up the rest of the world economy. Because where else are we going to get this growth? It ain't coming from Europe, that's for sure. Europe is heading for a serious recession. China is in its 94th lockdown. And actually, its economy is really stuttering now. You can forget all predictions that China will overtake the American economy in this decade in size. That ain't going to happen. So I think it's good that America will begin to get its act together again.
Lionel, let's keep with America, but move to politics. The last time I think I spoke to you on Spectator TV was after the midterms, and you were in quite a good mood because, not just because the red wave hadn't happened, but because Trumpist candidates, as many people have noticed, got defeated. All the Senate candidates in particular were defeated. Does that give you cause for optimism in 2023 that certainly the American right might return to something you regard more as sanity?
Well, the statistics would not bear that out. Not yet. If you look at the polls of Republican voters, the majority of them still support Trump. And the real question is whether or not they come to their senses in time. And there's not very much time left. A year from now, I think that the party has to have some sense of resolution about which direction they're going. And what's really frustrating is that, they have a wide open door in the White House. The Republicans could simply walk away with the executive branch in 24 if they just ran someone who wasn't Trump. This Trump thing is a drive to self-destruction. And honestly, I am certain DeSantis could do it. There are probably a number of candidates who can do it. I think that DeSantis is probably the best bet. But I feel that there's a funny kind of clock ticking. Little by little, Trump supporters are somewhat reduced in number. And nothing happens in the news in relation to that guy that you would think increase his support, aside from this whole persecution problem. And that's one thing that he's capitalizing on now. So that despite the fact that he's a former president of the United States, he's running as an underdog. And that plays into the natural paranoia of his supporters, because they do think that the world is against them, and that most of Trump's shenanigans are due to, the FBI and every other deep state organization coming after him. I don't personally, as a former Biden voter, it looks, I don't want him to run again. I don't want, and that's true. That makes me like the majority of the country. Something like 3/4 of American voters say they don't want either one of those two elderly gentlemen to be running again. And I have tremendous concerns about Biden's mental facilities, and they're certainly not going to be getting any better by the time he's 86. I had concerns about Trump and just how much he may have deteriorated. Because if you look at earlier recordings of Trump when he was younger, he was far more articulate. He spoke in complete sentences, and he didn't use the same word over and over again. He himself has also degenerated. And, it's a big country and we can do better. But, it is not impossible from this perspective that we end up with another Trump-Biden election in 24. And what's wrong with us? That's just terrible.
Well, let's cross back across the Atlantic and talk about Westminster, because after all, Lionel, we've had a pretty crazy year in British politics too. We've had 3 prime ministers. We've lost count of how many chancellors, so much so that at the Spectator Awards recently, our parliamentarian awards, we had a Chancellor of the Year award. I wonder to you, probably a bit of a silly question, but which politics seems crazier to you as an American in Britain, British or American?
I'm sorry, I really have to opt for the Americans. We beat you at everything.
I was hoping that would push us towards a conversation about Britain, but okay, we can go back to America.
I just, the shenanigans in the UK are on a completely different and, I have to say, lesser scale. It's not of great consequence in the big picture. And even the market's overreaction to Liz Truss, that has settled down, and I don't think it has had huge long-term consequences. Those interest rates were going up anyway. So I think that on the level of crazy, we have you beat. You don't have anyone like Trump in the wings threatening to take over the country. Everyone is relatively credible.
That's no doubt true. But Andrew, I mean, it hasn't been a good year for the Tory party. I think that's a fair thing to say.
We'll file that under British understatement.
So I think, can Rishi Sunak turn it around for the Tory party, or is Labour's lead now unassailable going into the next general election?
There's an outside chance he can turn it around. I don't think you can count that out. The country's not actually gagging for Keir Starmer. But it's probably not likely that he wins the election so much as the Tories lose it. So he could turn it around if we can get out of the recession, get on top of inflation, get some growth back, living standards rising again, get out of this cost of living crisis, then I wouldn't count it out. But there is a mountain to climb. I mean, it's perfectly possible in retrospect that historians will say 2022 was the year the Tories lost the election. Because they've just been self-indulgent and concerned with their own internal tribal divisions, and they seem to have lost any purpose for governing the country. What's the purpose of a Tory government now, except to do lots of non-Tory things, like raise taxes to the highest level in 70 years. It seems like a government that's just kind of run out of steam, and even a new leader like Mr. Sunak, who is bright and has lots of attractions, I think. He's a bright guy, he seems a nice guy, but he's yet to give them a sense of purpose. He's yet to reinvigorate the government, which new leaders can do. I mean, even John Major, not exactly the most invigorating character, taking over from Margaret Thatcher, he did invigorate the Tories by enough to win the 1992 election. But there's no sign that Mr. Sunak does that yet. And I remember in 1979, after 5 years of rather desultory Labour government, Jim Callaghan was the Prime Minister, and he was up against Margaret Thatcher in the spring of 79 or early summer of 79. And as people were debating in his inner circle, could he beat Thatcher? The polls were not that much against him. He said there just comes a time when the whole atmosphere turns against you. That when the climate is against you, and it doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to win. That turned out to be true in 79. It was definitely true in 97 when John Major lost by a landslide to Tony Blair. The danger for the Tories is it's now true for Mr. Sunak's Tories.
A lot of people are saying, Andrew, that reformist parties, the Reform Party, populist parties on the right may now have a resurgence because Brexit had sort of shot the UKIP fox, but now an angry right is re-emerging. Do you see signs of that?
No, I don't, actually. I don't see signs of that, and I think it's wishful thinking on the hardline Brexiteers. I'm also not sure that Mr. Farage wants to leave his rather comfortable perch in a 24-hour news station, which earns him a lot of money to go and do that. I don't see any... I think beyond the sort of square mile where you are, Freddie, nobody wants to relitigate that referendum. Nobody wants to go back through the Brexit, the Remainer, Leave arguments. Most people just, for good or ill, they just want to move on. The cards lie where they lie, and we just need to get on with it. And interesting, that is the view of Keir Starmer as well. He doesn't want to break. There are people around him who would love to do it. He's not going to do it. So I think, no, the Reform Party is not going to have a demonstrable influence on British politics that it hopes it might have. I think it's back in England, at least it's back to Labour Conservative. Even the Lib Dems, Freddie, don't seem to be making much of a breakthrough because Mr. Starmer has made it possible for Lib Dem-minded people to vote Labour again. They don't need to vote for the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who I can just remember, Mr. Davey. And one of the interesting things, too, is that if it is time, if it's Labour's turn again, that cauterises, sidelines the whole Scottish separatist movement, because it is much harder to run a separatist campaign against a Labour government in London than a Conservative government in London. So, I think there are quite big changes, quite watershed events about to happen in Britain as a result of the way things are at the moment. I would say it's 3-4 to 1 against the Tories winning the next election. But we know things can change, and, we live in, who would have seen the Ukraine war coming? I mean, I was very optimistic about the economy of this year, on both sides of the Atlantic. I saw growth returning, investment returning, and all the rest of it. Lionel's right, inflation was starting to rise. The central banks made a terrible call on that, and we've all suffered for that. But I still thought there would be some growth. And I never saw the Ukraine war. What was it Don Rumsfeld said? I think that was one of these unknown unknowns.
Yeah. Let us wrap this up, if I may, both of you, on an attempt at a more cheerful note, because Christmas is supposed to be a source of optimism for humanity. Andrew, in our Christmas edition, I'll start with you, Andrew. In our Christmas edition, we asked various contributors, including the Dalai Lama, amazingly enough, what gives them hope. So I wonder, Andrew, going into 2023, what gives you hope?
Well, I don't know what the Dalai Lama said, but whatever he said, I agree with. I've interviewed him. He's the most impressive person I've ever interviewed. And you're speaking to the least spiritual person in the world here. Listen, here's the thing. I think Ukraine is in 2023, Ukraine is going to win the war. What does win look like? That's debatable. But for sure, Russia ain't going to win it. And I think Ukraine wins it, and it will be a terrible defeat for Russia. And suddenly things will get back to normal, and we'll be pouring resources into Ukraine to help build it. I think inflation will come down much more quickly than the forecasters say, just as it went up much more quickly than the forecasters thought. Indeed, if you begin to look at towards the end of 2024 or 25, you begin to see deflation beginning to take a grip. But for a while, as inflation plummets, it'll make us feel better. It'll raise our living standards, and we'll come out of the cost of living and a crisis. And if people start to spend more again, then growth returns to the economy. So I don't despair. Both as journalists and as politicians, we find it very hard to discern when the trend we're living through comes to an end. And we kind of act as if trees grow to the sky. That, inflation is now double digits. It's always going to be double digits. We've got no growth. We're going to have no growth for the foreseeable future. I think there'll be quite a dramatic turnaround led by America in the economic outlook. So I am more positive on the economic outlook as 2023 proceeds. We're heading into recession. There's no doubt about that, but I don't think it's going to be that deep or that long. And I think as prices start to fall more quickly than the forecasters think, and you're already beginning to see a bit of that in America now as well, the economic optimism will return. So I don't think there's a need for endless gloom, however much some people need to feel they should be in endless gloom just to keep them happy.
Thank you, Andrew. You've cheered me up, which is almost impossible at the moment. Lionel, what gives you hope?
I've been much cheered by what's been going on in China. On multiple levels. I mean, it is satisfying as someone who has opposed COVID lockdowns from the very beginning to see that policy taken to the max and to see it fail. It doesn't work. And lockdown came from China, and it's dying in China. It's also a relief to see the Chinese people be able to draw a line and say enough is enough. I think we in the West often write the Chinese off as just hopelessly compliant, and they'll do whatever they're told. They've been turned into little automatons, but they're not. And they suffer under a huge amount of control and oppression, and someone is always watching them. I don't feel envious, but there have been a lot of people who have now stuck their necks out and even in defiance of such would-be absolute control, say, we're not taking this anymore. And I think that's a really good sign. So it's good for the spectacle internationally of a highly destructive response to disease. It's good that it looks bad. I was amused how many Western media outlets responded to the Chinese protests. It's like, oh, of course, this policy is terrible. It doesn't work. Where were you 2 years ago, you bastards? And I also think that what's going on in Iran is cheerful. I mean, amidst a lot of horror. I mean, they're now starting to execute protesters. But this is it's mostly young women who will not take it anymore, and I think that it's been well observed that the left in the West doesn't seem remotely interested, which is bizarre. I mean, when you think about, well, isn't this the ultimate Me Too patriarchy, where you have to go around, in a bin liner? I mean, it's a horribly repressive regime for women in particular, and it's bizarre to me that the women's movement in the West is not interested. But I'm interested, and I really wish them the best. I mean, I am a little skeptical because so many of these revolutions come to nothing. Think the Arab Spring, but before this one also comes to nothing, I'm going to be optimistic.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end it on. Human freedom will always flourish. Andrew, Neil and Lionel Shriver, thank you very much, and a very happy Christmas to you both.
Thank you. Merry Christmas to you too.
Now, of course, one of the most distressing stories of this year has been the war in Ukraine. And we are delighted to be joined now by Andrey Kurkov, who is Ukraine's greatest living novelist, I think I may say. And he has written a brilliant notebook in the Christmas edition about life in his village of Lazarivka, which is 50 miles from Kiev. I think I'm right in saying, Andrey?
Yes.
That's right. And you're there at the moment. First of all, I want to ask, because I spoke to a Ukrainian last night who was quite surprised at how cold it was in Britain. And I thought it was very odd because I always assumed that Ukraine is much, much colder. Is it very cold there right now?
Today it is only -1. I mean, we had several days with +5, +7 centigrade weather, rain, fog, but now it's back to frost, and it was even sunny for a couple of hours today.
I also wanted to ask you about what the atmosphere is like in your village, because obviously last year a lot of people were anticipating war, and Ukrainians in particular were anticipating it, I believe. How has the year changed your view of things? Are you more optimistic about 2023? Are you optimistic for peace next year?
It's difficult to talk about optimism, but people are looking forward to the end of this year. So, I mean, the main idea is to say goodbye to this year. The war became some sort of banality because people actually don't talk much about the war since, I mean, when they want to know something, they watch TV or they go into news. So I mean, I didn't talk during my last 3 days with neighbors about the war at all. And we were talking about food. I was helping my neighbor Nina to go to nearest town to buy food for her chickens today. And then I had coffee in the vegetable shop in Brusilov. And also, I mean, I talked to a shop assistant and she didn't mention the war. Because, I mean, it's probably upsetting if you start talking about the war. But of course, I mean, Ukrainians are hoping that the war will be over next year. And it's interesting that regularly in the news we have some quotations from American or British army generals who are saying that Ukrainian army will free Crimea by August next year, or that Kherson region will be completely freed by May or June. So, I mean, this is kind of injections of, I don't know, justifiable or not justifiable optimism probably lifts up the mood to feed the festive mood of the Christmas that is coming.
And do you think that, I mean, President Zelensky has become a sort of global hero and so on, but before the war started, Ukrainians weren't terribly sure about him, were they?
They were not sure, and I don't know if they are sure about him now, but majority of Ukrainians support him, and most of the politicians are united because of the common enemy, because of the common danger to the existence of Ukraine. Once the war is over, I think the opinions will be divided again. But anyway, I mean, he is doing a good job. I mean, he managed to sort of almost to organize some kind of army detachment from the heads of foreign states. So he is talking to them every day. They are promising more ammunition and more weapons, and actually this weapon is coming. So everything is functioning. But I mean, one should also accept that the Russian army, which was considered to be one of the most professional ones, is also becoming more professional in this war. So I think it's more and more difficult to fight against Russians.
You are a native Russian speaker, and I think I'm right in saying that a lot of native Russian Ukrainians, or people who spoke Russian first in Ukraine, have been united to Ukraine more through the war. I spoke to a Ukrainian oligarch, Dmitry Firtash, who said that Putin had achieved the one thing that no one else could do, and that was unite all of Ukraine. Would you agree with that assessment?
I would agree, but I would actually probably add that what happened, that Russian speakers got extremely disconnected with everything Russian. And many of Russian speakers started speaking Ukrainian more often, or just purposely forgetting Russian language. It depends on the situation, because I met people who always spoke Russian and who lost everything in Donbass, in Mariupol, and they started speaking actually Ukrainian with each other, the family, and they never spoke Ukrainian before. They understood it. Now they are learning, they are practicing it. So I think one of the most evident victims of this war will be Russian language in Ukraine.
And is that a sadness for you?
Well, it is. It was sad when I was thinking about this in the beginning, but I'm not paying too much attention to this issue, because this is not the most important victim. The most important victim is actually Ukraine itself, Ukrainian families that lost everything, that lost loved ones, the Ukrainian soldiers, of whom probably about 20,000 are killed now and much more wounded. So it's no sense to feel sorry for the language. And especially since actually this war destroyed the notion of Russian culture itself. So I don't think Russian culture will mean the same now also outside Russia and Ukraine, in Britain, in Europe, in America, after this war. Because, you cannot associate culture with this kind of monster that Russia managed to become.
Well, that's interesting. Is it because would it not be more normal to fixate on Putin and the Kremlin administration rather than Russian culture as a broader thing?
No, I think it's important to understand that Russian culture was and is instrumentalized by Putin and the political elite, and actually even on local level. In the beginning of the war, Ministry of Culture of Russian Federation sent official letters to the libraries asking them to organize activities to support Russian army in Ukraine. And what did they do? They involved Pushkin, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy in this war. They decorated monuments to Pushkin with Russian army memorabilia, with Z letters, with some kind of medals of the Russian army. So for me, it's the same. And actually, since majority of Russian population supported the war, and they are so anti-Ukrainian, anti-American, anti-Western. So I think we have a right to talk about Russian culture as part of today's Russian state.
Well, I wondered, finally, are you working on a new novel at the moment? I assume you probably are. And if so, are Ukrainian nationalist themes or patriotic themes emerging in your work?
I'm not writing a novel, unfortunately. I interrupted work on my novel about 1919 in Kyiv in the beginning of the war, the first day of the war. And I didn't manage to get back to work. I'm still writing essays and articles and my diaries. And I'm dreaming of actually restarting the novel that I put aside. But the story in the novel will not be changed. Actually, it's a historical crime novel set in the Civil War time that lasted 4 years, from 1918 till 1921, and which had a lot of things which are happening now. It was the same kind of violence with which Russian army at that time, Red Army, the Bolsheviki, came to Ukraine from the same northeastern side, from Belarusian side. And they did actually in Kyiv in 1918 the same that a Russian army did in Bucha and Irpin in February, March this year. So it's not actually about patriotism. It's about the history repeating itself.
Well, Andrey Kurkov, thank you very much for joining us. I hope that you have a happy Christmas, whichever day you celebrate it on. And I hope as well that you get to restart your novel in a peaceful 2023.
Thank you very much. Happy Christmas to you too.
Now, since it is Christmas, we thought we would give our viewers what they want. And we know what they want because they put it in the comments a lot. And that what they want is more Rod Liddle. So, as a Christmas treat, here he is, our health and wellness correspondent, Rod Liddle, who has a typically brilliant column in our Christmas edition about wokery. Rod, I thought I'd start by saying, because we have a bit of a debate in the office about whether to use the word woke, because on one hand it seems to have degenerated into a meaningless term of abuse, and on the other it's a very useful catch-all for a lot of the things that are most awful about the world. You clearly have decided you will use it, but do you know what I mean when I say that it's
I know exactly what you mean. It's an awful word, and it doesn't quite express what we mean when we say it. Progressive politics is one way around it. Identitarian politics is another way around it, though that doesn't quite get you into the decolonization stuff quite so easily, and the trashing of the nation's history. I mean, the reason I use it, and you used it in this particular piece, is that everyone understands it.
Yes.
Everyone knows what I mean. There are other words. Wank, for example, is one such. And I did once use that, but any four-letter word beginning with W, indeed. I think I do.
Well, as you say in the column, it is not cultural Marxism, is it? Even though a lot of people, particularly right-wingers, like to say that it is.
No, I don't think it's anything to do with cultural Marxism. As I say in the column, Marx was... I don't have a huge amount of love for Karl Marx, but you could not argue him of being anything other than both an empiricist and a communitarian. I mean, those two things, he is rather famously both of those two things, whereas wokery and identity politics is kind of post-rational and has no time for empiricism whatsoever. And it's, of course, by definition, individualistic.
I suppose what people are getting at there is that they think it's a sort of it's on a mission to march through the institutions and destroy them all.
Yeah, it's the old Gramsci thing, sure, but they also mean that it's left wing. It's a bit like anyone who's accused of being right wing. Eventually, the comparison stretches back to Hitler. So it is with anything on the left. If you wish to denigrate it, you say it's Marxist. So that's about as far as it goes. I mean, there is some truth that the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, particularly Habermas, Marcuse, there's something in there which feeds in, without question, to what we call wokeism. Largely a sense of a disdain of bourgeois moral values and a dislike of any form of authority. And this injunction that one had to express oneself. Christ, has anything done us more damage than that? Expressing oneself. So there is a little bit of that in there. But I also think, by the same token, there's a little bit of the Frankfurt, of the Chicago School of Economics in there, which was also very, very individualistic, and did away with the notion of society. Didn't really agree with society, or thought it was something that one should stay away from if at all possible, and was about but that was largely about money. But nonetheless, it was very, very individualistic, and I don't think it's a surprise that both on left and right, the dominant ideologies post World War II have been away from the communitarian and towards the individualistic.
Well, and on that,
all getting a bit heavy, isn't it?
No, I'm liking it. I'm liking it. Yeah, you're explaining it very well. I'm learning a lot. But I mean, on the individualistic stuff, I mean, it's also, let's keep it heavy for a while. It's also about relativism, isn't it?
It's entirely. And I think it was Richard Hoggart who first, I first read, actually noticed this tendency in British life and Western life towards a kind of vapid and vacant moral relativism, and which you hear these days from skanks and morons when they say things like, "Don't judge me, don't judge me." Well, I will judge you, you skank. I will judge you, and you cannot stop me doing so. But no, you're right. It's a moral relativism. But I mean, more crucially than anything, what wokery is something which cannot be challenged, because it's all based upon personal experience. It's my lived experience. That's my lived experience. And well, no, this is my truth. So it's something which you cannot challenge, rationally or empirically. And it's very clear about that. I mean, it was the one of the boards which advises Britain's universities said it wished to get university teaching away from European-based rational discourse. I mean, they're very, very clear that it's not rational. And of course, when you look at all the different strands, the intersectional, all the strands of wokeism, many of them contradict each other. It's hilarious.
Well, one thing I did want to challenge you on slightly is that you say it's a
challenge.
Well, I'm going to challenge you. You're going to get offended. You say that wokery is a creature of affluence because nobody in Somalia or Chad gets terribly worked up if you misgender them. I wanted to ask you, Rod, have you ever tried to misgender anyone in Somalia or Chad? Because I have a sneaking feeling that they might be quite offended.
I don't think they would be at all. What I mean, that was a way of capturing the fact that there is no wokeism in those countries, and there isn't. And you know there isn't. So don't sit there pretending there is, Frederick.
Okay.
Don't try and pretend to me that in South Sudan they're terribly worried about trans quotas for the next person to, become village elder and chop off someone's head. They are not bothered about that.
I think if you kept calling the village elder a woman, he might get quite cross. But anyway, I'm being facetious. So let's carry on.
You're being impish, aren't you? You're being impish.
Yeah.
Impish.
How dare I? Let's go on to religion, because that's an important part of your piece and your thesis, which is that wokery is a sort of, it has filled the void of religion, if you like.
Well, except it hasn't. I mean, it hasn't really filled the void because the thing which religion gave us was some easily understandable, perhaps simplistic commandments by which we ought to live our lives, as well as stuff like, the notions of deferred gratification, the benefits of working hard, the benefits of saving money and of doing good in this life. Religion gave us all of that, and we've retreated from religion. We're now effectively a secular country. I don't think wokeism has filled the void. I don't think anything has filled the void. And, I spoke to Charles Murray, the sociologist, the American sociologist, a while ago. And he told me at the end of our conversation, he said, I'm very interested in Europe. This is a continent which has abolished God, and it would be interesting to see what they put in its place. And the answer is nothing, nothing at all. So I think the retreat of religion, or the retreat of us from religion, has been one of the things which has fed into the rise of wokery. There are many, almost infinite number of other things which have fed into it.
My father used to say that we have externalized, traditionally we used to externalize religion and internalize morality, and nowadays we do the opposite. Is it because we've been doing that for decades now that we have wokery?
Well, the causes, as I say, I think the causes of wokery are many, many-fold, and touch on such things as the reform of the divorce laws, the movement of women into the labour market, the way in which we teach children in schools, the growth of human resources, the HR departments, the growth of health and safety legislation. All these things have fed into it. And my point is that we've kind of built wokery ourselves, and are now the recipients of it. So we only have ourselves to blame. In terms of, you're suggesting that these days we externalize morality.
Yes, so we put it on other people, but not ourselves.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. There's some truth in that. But what we've also done is the great mantra of the last 40 years is to remove stigma. So we try to remove stigma from people who have mental illnesses. We remove stigma from single mothers. We remove stigma these days from the morbidly obese. And the problem is that stigma is a useful societal tool for preventing antisocial behaviour. And if you remove stigma, as we have seen, the numbers of people who are morbidly obese or are single mothers will grow exponentially, and they have. I mean, actually, in the case of single mothers, exponentially in its proper term. So we cannot bear, this is part of the moral relativism stuff, which is we cannot bear to judge other people on their lifestyles because we're all individuals and society doesn't really matter. It's the Thatcher mantra in a way. So no one can be judged, and we can't say to them, you're doing wrong. You're doing something which will deeply harm yourself, harm your children, and harm society. We're not allowed to say that anymore.
Well, if it is inadequate as a replacement religion, do you think it will collapse quite quickly and that something else, possibly Islam, will spring up in its place?
Well, Islam has continued to exist as a consequence of its refusal to change with shifting morals, and in a way that the Church of England has tried to survive and is not doing so at the moment by accommodating new social morals. So yeah, I think there is, not necessarily Islam, but certainly if you look at the religions which are growing in this country, it tends to be the somewhat robust side of Protestantism. They're the Pentecostalists. Pentecostalists are thriving, and growing by the month, whereas the lily-livered Church of England is in kind of terminal decline, as is, sadly for me, a church which once did know about morality, and that's the Methodist Church, but it's also become very, very lefty and woke.
One thing you put a list of things which you've mentioned slightly there about things that have sort of contributed towards the rise of wokery. Yeah. The diminution of marriage and the reform of the divorce laws, the lack of an external threat to this country. I was very interested by that. That's. I mean, if you know your sociology, right back to Durkheim, one of the first major sociological studies, Emil Durkheim's study of suicide, which tends not to happen when countries are at war. People tend not to kill themselves. There is a sense. The point being that there is a sense they can go get killed somewhere else.
What? Yeah, they get killed in another way. Yeah, absolutely. But the point is that we'd emerged in 1945 from a war in which the overriding message was one of communitarianism, that we're all in this together, that we all fight together, that we do our duty, and that we're fighting for something rather noble. And what you tended to get is much less mental health, much fewer mental health problems amongst the population, fewer suicides, a greater sense of togetherness, a greater sense of pulling together. Whereas the generation which follows that, which is both the boomer generation and indeed the Generation X and Generation Z and the millennials, haven't had that. I mean, to a degree, the boomers have a kind of existential threat hanging over their heads in terms of nuclear warfare, which produced a slightly different response to actually being bombed. The fear of being bombed is different to actually being bombed, I think. But no, I think because we've been safe, I'm not suggesting that we should have a good war, Freddy, or anything like that, that would do it. I'm just saying, any more than I'm saying that, we shouldn't have had women into the workplace. I mean, that it would be an absurdity to say that. What I'm saying is that these things have in their own way contributed towards a more individualistic society and a woker society.
Do you think it might explain why we're perhaps lusting after a threat, which might explain some of the pandemic response, possibly the sort of almost bizarre wish that Putin was posing a nuclear threat, a nuclear threat? Well,
I think there's a few things probably not associated with wokeism going on with Russia. Partly, I think it's a sense of comfort amongst the military establishment and to a degree the politicians, that we're fighting an enemy we understand once again. Whereas, previous to that, our biggest threats seem to come from radical Islam, and we didn't have a clue about how to deal with that. So I think there's a degree of comfort there, and also a slight smugness that actually the Russians aren't very good, despite their history. So I think I think there's also something which kind of touches on what you were saying, that Slavoj Žižek often says, and said about smoking actually, which is that we have outlawed racism and sexism and homophobia and Islamophobia, but we still need someone to hate. And Slavoj suggested that smokers were one of them, and I think he's right. I think, that's an easy thing to hate. But I think for wokery, some of it is down to a middle class which isn't allowed to hate anything else and thinks it's rather bad to hate things. At least they can hate the lower classes with their awful, awful views about things such as transgenderism and immigration.
Rod, that's been a very jolly section, appropriate to Christmas.
Happy Christmas, Freddy.
Happy Christmas. Thank you for putting on tinsel. That's all our viewers could have wanted. Thanks again, Rod. In August this year, the illustrator and author Raymond Briggs died. He was the creator of such very famous and often evocative of Christmas books as The Snowman and Fungus the Bogeyman, and Gentleman Jim and others. I'm joined now by Juliet Nicolson, the author who was his friend, who's written a very lovely piece in our Christmas edition about Raymond Briggs. It's under the headline, Juliet, Father Curmudgeon, which I think is a little bit unfair on the piece, but it does reflect that he was not what you might call full of the joy of Christmas. Is that fair to say?
Raymond couldn't stand Christmas. It was his sort of worst time of year. And illustrated actually always in the Christmas cards that he sent me, which were a sort of series of, I don't know if I hold one up. Here is one, choice one. Funeral costs keep rising. This is my Christmas card from him. And inside it says, better hurry up then. And then there was another one that was here we are. Oh gosh, I've got so many of them. Here we are. It's a completely sort of, I think it's Lithuanian. I'm not sure. It's a picture of Raymond on the front, but inside it says, are you lacking in energy, forgetful, depressed, unable to sleep, anxious? Of course you are. It's Christmas, written in Raymond's writing.
Well, let's talk about how you met him. You met him when you were working for his publisher, I think, and he would refer to you as blooming publicity. What was it? Blooming publicity women.
It was in the 1970s, and he'd already started to make a bit of a name for himself with Father Christmas. I mean, more than a bit of a name. He had started out as an illustrator for other books, other people's books, and for collections of fairy stories and so on. And then someone said to him, why don't you have a go and do it on your own? And so his Father Christmas, this so-called curmudgeon, had hit an absolute chord with children and grown-ups alike, with a picture of Father Christmas on the loo before he sets off on his great journey for that night and so on. And so we knew that as publishers that we had already somebody very original, a voice perhaps in the tradition, if you can call it that, of Roald Dahl, who was doing the subversive that children were just suddenly feeling. He's talking to us. We like to laugh about, people sitting on the loo in a way. And then one day he appeared with some artwork that puzzled us because it was accompanied by no text. And it was a picture of a little boy building a snowman. And his editor, Julia McCrae, said, well, Raymond, we can't, where's the text? Is it on its way? There is no text. These words, these pictures are words in themselves. And of course, this magical story, the classic, perhaps, children's story for Christmas now, of a little boy who builds a snowman, who comes to life, and who flies over the countryside in which Raymond himself lived. So there is the Brighton Pavilion. You know, there are the Downs of Sussex, Raymond's own home. Immediately, the sort of identifiable magic. So therefore, it became much more real because it was linked to real life, real recognition life, magic within one's own life. And so he insisted, no words, and there it was, published, wordless and beautiful.
Do you think that, I mean, clearly he wasn't one for sentimentality at Christmas as a man, but do you think he expressed his sentimentality in his art?
I think he was a man of intense nostalgia. He'd grown up, his father was a milkman, on whom it is always said he based Father Christmas himself. His mother was a bit posher. She was a lady's maid, and they'd fallen in love, and they'd lived in the aftermath of the Second World War, where values and hardship were survivable values. The values of keep batting on was what he'd grown up with, and so spoilt brattery and excess and commercialization of Christmas or anything else did not sit well with Raymond. So I don't know if you actually would say sentimentality, much more a sense of unchanging values and not liking the world that we were suddenly finding ourselves within. And when he moved away from writing children's books, the book that he himself said that he was proudest of was his biography, his pictorial biography of his parents, Ethel and Ernest, which, if nobody has read this, it is heartbreaking, but it is also very funny. And yes, always was the book that he himself said that he was proudest of. So he was always looking back to a time that was quieter and gentler, and the time of his childhood where somehow the world didn't seem to be running at such a fast pace and was full of magic.
And do you think that's why the snowman is so evocative or moving for people? Is this lack of words? Is that why he did it without words? Because actually he felt words got in the way of feeling.
Well, he wasn't a words man. Actually, he was very. His words were well chosen, but short, you know, and he communicated through his art. So that was his communication. He didn't need the words. Of course, the film that came afterwards, which he was, you know, he was so reluctant to go commercial and to have this film made, the one that's always shown at Christmas. But it is accompanied by this heartbreaking music. And I was in a shop last week, and there it is playing on the sound system. So I think now, for the sort of generation that grew up with the film and the book, the music does add a kind of emotional intensity to it that I think is wonderful. And I think Raymond did. I think he agreed that it was a lovely addition.
Well, finally, Juliet, you say at the end you will be putting the funeral card, as you call it, which you've shown us, will stay in the drawer this year. But do you think you'll ever bring it out again at Christmas?
Well, it is definitely a sad idea to bring that Christmas card out. No, I don't want to think about Raymond and funerals, not this year. But I think maybe next year, you know, I'll have another laugh and think of Raymond in the sky, eating a bun and having a cup of tea and having a bit of a laugh as he looks down on us.
Good for you, Juliet. Thank you very much indeed, and a very happy Christmas. Now, because this is our Christmas edition, and there is a piece in our Christmas edition, the printed edition, about mistletoe by the brilliant Andrew Watts, I thought we should talk about mistletoe. Andrew, mistletoe is famously toxic. It's a parasite. How come it's now associated with Christmas? Give us a bit of the story.
It is actually, and one of the people I was trying to get in touch with to talk about mistletoe has a website where he sells mistletoe seeds that you can plant, and it was banned by my laptop because it was too poisonous. Whoever is in charge of internet censorship thought you shouldn't be able to buy toxic chemicals like mistletoe berries. But that's not the reason that it's a symbol of love. And it is actually quite disgusting. It's because when you squeeze the berries, you do get this white substance that is reminiscent.
Right. I thought it was innocent kissing.
No,
You'll make it sound a lot worse than that. I thought in the era of Me Too, though, mistletoe might have been banned because, as I understand it, the tradition, which was a sort of Victorian tradition, is that if a woman is under the mistletoe and a man demands a kiss, she cannot deny him, which surely is completely unacceptable now.
Yes, although it does seem to be dying out. I mean, I know lots of people have never seen mistletoe, and it's not as popular as holly and ivy, except in Tenbury Wells, of course. It's because mistletoe only grows in very rare parts of the country, and I live in Cornwall, and you don't see it at all. And then when I drove up to Gloucestershire to this festival, you see it on all the trees, particularly at this time of the year when the trees are empty of leaves. You just see these huge boughs of mistletoe in those four counties around there, the southwest Midlands. And that was in the Victorian period where all the mistletoe in the country came from. And one town in particular, Tenbury Wells, cornered the market. They had a huge auction, and most of the mistletoe that you see in the shops would have come through there.
Does mistletoe actually kill its host? Is it destructive to the trees on which it grows?
There's some debate about that. I mean, if it gets too heavy, then it will break them in the wind. But it was thought in the past that it just took water from the branches, so it might have affected its health, but wouldn't kill it. Now, scientists think that it actually takes some sugars and other minerals. But it is definitely a parasite.
But so, I mean, you don't think it's going to fade? I mean, do you regard it as a pagan tradition? And it is sort of druidic, as you say in your piece. But I suppose most Christian traditions are. The Christmas tree is fairly pagan, is it not?
Absolutely. And most of them were invented by Charles Dickens, as indeed the custom of kissing under the mistletoe was. It was a tradition in Monmouthshire, and he, in the Pickwick Papers, spread it around the country. And it was about the same time as the trains were starting. And that's where the Tenbury Wells mistletoe got the stranglehold over the country. I think a lot of these town festivals, they only start celebrating them when they stop being important. And I grew up in a village where there's now a scarecrow festival. And when I was growing up, there wasn't, but there were still scarecrows in the fields. And I think once the actual purpose disappears, people start getting more excited about it.
Do you associate mistletoe with your childhood memories of Christmas? We don't need to get into kissing.
Oh, no. Gosh, no. No, my mother did not approve of that sort of thing. Her children would have thought it vulgar. And imagine having to kiss your mother.
Oh, yeah, that is bad. Yeah. Andrew, I think we'll end it there, but happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas to you.
And I hope you avoid all mistletoe.
Thank you.
That is it for the year in 60 minutes from Spectator TV. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have and you're not already a subscriber, please do subscribe by hitting the subscribe button at the bottom of your screen and then hit the bell icon to get a reminder so that you never, ever miss an episode. I would also encourage you with all of my heart to subscribe to The Spectator, We are the greatest magazine in the world, after all. And we are currently running an amazing Christmas offer, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show. For just £12, you get 12 weeks of The Spectator in print and online. And on top of that, we throw in a bottle of Paul Roger champagne. What could be better? Thank you very much for watching. I hope that you all have a very happy 2023 and a very, very happy Christmas.